She had saved men in burning buildings, in gunfire, in the dark. Nobody on that plane knew it. All they saw was a faded jacket, a worn canvas bag, a quiet woman with a dog who didn't belong in first class. So they had her removed. 3 rows back, a colonel watched her stand up without a word. And when Viper's metal tags caught the cabin light, Silas Mercer felt the blood drain from his face. He knew that name. He'd stood at that dog's handler's grave 7 years ago. So who was this woman, and why did the dog follow her like she was the only person left on Earth? Before we go further, if stories like this hit different, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Every week I bring you stories about the people the world walks past without looking twice. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go. The terminal was the kind of loud that felt personal. Announcements stacked on top of each other. A child screaming 3 gates down. The mechanical groan of a boarding bridge latching into place. Coffee machines hissing behind scratched plexiglass counters. And underneath all of it, the particular silence of people who had learned to move through crowds without being seen. Mara Vance was one of those people. She stood at the end of the boarding line with a Belgian Malinois sitting at her left heel, perfectly still, like a statue someone had forgotten to bolt to the floor. The dog's name was Viper. 81 pounds of retired military working dog, with a scar that ran along his lower ribcage like a crooked seam on old leather. He had a muzzle that had been broken and reset wrong. He had eyes the color of creek water in November, pale, flat, always watching. Mara had her hand resting just above his withers, not holding him, just there. She wore a canvas jacket the color of old khaki. It had a small burn mark on the left cuff she'd never bothered to explain to anyone. Her bag was one of those oversized totes from a grocery chain, stuffed with a change of clothes, a pouch of dog food, a battered paperback with a cracked spine, and a Ziploc bag holding Viper's medication and vet records. She did not look like someone who belonged in first class. She had the ticket anyway. General Warren Pike had purchased it. He'd insisted, in the particular way that retired 4-stars insist on things, quietly, once, with a tone that made arguing feel like bad manners. You need to get to Salt Lake City. You're not riding in coach with a dog that size. End of conversation. Mara hadn't argued. She'd just accepted the ticket with the same expression she used for everything. Neutral, steady, already elsewhere in her head. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass without looking up. First class, 3A, down the jet bridge and to the left. I know how a plane works, Mara said. Not rude, just factual. The agent looked up then, looked at the jacket, looked at the dog, opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then closed it again. Viper stared at her. The agent looked away first. First class on a domestic aircraft is never as impressive as the brochure suggests. 6 rows, wider seats, a curtain separating you from the rest of the plane, like a stage prop that everyone pretends means something. The carpet was navy blue and had been shampooed recently enough that it still smelled like industrial cleaner beneath the recirculated air. Mara settled into 3A by the window. Viper curled under the seat in front of her, or tried to. He was too big. His back haunches stuck out into the aisle slightly, and he didn't care, and Mara didn't make him move. She pulled out the paperback, cracked it open to somewhere in the middle, started reading, or looked like she was reading. Her eyes moved across the page, but her right hand stayed low, fingers resting against the top of Viper's head. The couple arrived 8 minutes before the boarding door closed. They came down the aisle the way certain people always do, walking like the floor was specifically built for them, like everyone else was just set dressing in their morning. The man was in his late 50s, silver-haired, good suit, the kind of tan that came from somewhere with a pool. The woman beside him wore a silk blouse under a blazer and carried a handbag that probably cost more than 3 months of Mara's diner wages. Their seats were 2B and 2C, right across the aisle. The woman stopped. She looked at Viper's hindquarters extending into the aisle space. Then she looked at Mara, took in the jacket, the grocery store bag, the fact that Mara hadn't looked up from her book. Excuse me. Mara turned a page. Excuse me. Louder this time. Mara looked up. Her face was calm. It was the specific calm of someone who had learned to be very, very still when provoked. Is that your animal? Yes. It's in the aisle. He's mostly under the seat. The woman's husband had settled into 2B without a word, his eyes on his phone, already out of the situation. But his wife was not done. This is first class, she said, slowly, like maybe Mara hadn't understood the first time. There are certain standards. He has documentation, Mara said. Retired military working dog. He's cleared to travel in cabin. I didn't ask about documentation. The woman's voice had taken on that particular edge, not quite angry yet, but warming up to it. I'm asking about common courtesy. Most people don't bring animals into, but most people don't have them, Mara said quietly. She turned another page. He's not bothering anything. He's bothering me. Mara said nothing, which was the wrong move. Not because she was wrong to be quiet, but because silence in those situations gets read as submission by people who have never had to be truly still. The woman took it as an opening. She flagged down the flight attendant. Her name was Cassidy. Mid-30s, professional, the careful smile of someone who had handled hundreds of these situations and had learned that the customer with the louder voice usually won, not because they were right, but because it was easier. Is there a problem? Cassidy asked. There is, the woman said. She didn't even gesture toward Mara, just let her presence make the argument. I'd like to know how this is appropriate for first class. Cassidy looked at Mara, looked at the bag, looked at the dog, looked back at the woman in the silk blouse. The math happened fast. Ma'am, Cassidy said, turning to Mara, I'm so sorry. Would you be willing to move back to... I have a first-class ticket. I understand that. And he has his documentation in the side pocket of my bag if you want to... It's not about documentation, Cassidy said, her voice hitting that smooth, practiced note of airline diplomacy that means please don't make this harder than it has to be. It's just, if there are comfort concerns... Her comfort concern, Mara said, is that she doesn't like looking at us. The cabin had gone a specific kind of quiet, not the silence of empty space, the silence of people pretending they aren't listening. Cassidy's smile didn't break, but it went tight at the corners. We have open seats in premium economy. No. Ma'am, no. Mara closed her book. Her voice hadn't risen at all. It was still flat, still even, still that peculiar quiet that felt less like calm and more like a decision. I have a first-class ticket. This dog has cleared documentation. I'm not moving because someone doesn't like how I look. 3 seconds passed. The woman across the aisle made a small sound of offense, and then Cassidy said, quietly, almost apologetically, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your things. Mara looked at her for a moment. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't do any of the things that would have made her memorable in a bad way or created a scene they'd have to manage at 30,000 feet. She just stood up, picked up her grocery bag, tucked the paperback into her jacket pocket, said quietly to Viper, heel, and walked back through the curtain. The woman in the silk blouse watched her go with the satisfied expression of someone who had just corrected an inconvenience. She settled into her seat, opened her own book, actual leather cover, obviously new, said something low to her husband, who nodded without looking up from his phone. Nobody in first class said anything. Colonel Silas Mercer had been watching from the moment the woman and the dog boarded. Not because they stood out, not at first. He'd been watching the way he always watched, the old military habit of cataloging a space when you entered it. Exits, faces, movement. You didn't stop doing it just because you'd turned in your last set of combat gear. The brain rewired itself, and that was that. He was 61 years old. He had the kind of face that had looked 55 for the last decade and would probably stay there. Short gray hair, a jaw that looked like it had been squared off with a carpenter's tool. He wore civilian clothes, dark slacks, a pale blue shirt, but he sat in his seat the way military men sit, spine straight, both feet flat, hands visible. He'd watched the whole exchange. He'd watched the woman stand up without a word, watched her walk back through the curtain with the dog at her heel and a canvas bag on her shoulder and zero expression on her face, like she'd performed this calculation before and already knew the answer. He'd felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger. Not exactly. Something older than anger. something that had to do with a particular kind of injustice that military people carried a special sensitivity for. The kind where someone did something quietly extraordinary and the world paid no attention at all. But that wasn't what made him go still. What made him go still was the dog. Because when Viper passed row 7, when he padded by at perfect heel, head down, those pale eyes straight ahead, his metal tags caught the overhead light. The engraving was small, military standard, a number, a unit designation, and beneath that, in slightly larger letters, a name, Eli Rourke. Silas stopped breathing for exactly 2 seconds. He knew that name the way you know a song that was playing on the worst night of your life. You don't have to remember it. It's just there, in the tissue of you. Staff Sergeant Eli Rourke, K-9 handler, 3rd Special Forces Group, killed in action during a classified recovery operation 7 years ago in a country whose name Silas couldn't say out loud in a domestic airport without 6 phone calls happening at once. Silas had stood at his grave. He had watched Eli's mother fold a flag against her chest with both hands and stare at the middle distance like the world had gone 2-dimensional. And here was Eli's dog, walking through a domestic airport cabin like it was nothing, following a woman in a burned jacket who had just been asked to leave first class for not looking expensive enough. Silas sat very still for a moment, the kind of still that means you're moving very fast on the inside. Then he leaned forward and said to the man in front of him, "Excuse me, did you get her name?" The man shook his head without turning around. Not his business. Silas unbuckled his seatbelt. He moved to the aisle, walked back through the curtain to Premium Economy, and found her in seat 13F. Window again, Viper wedged more comfortably beneath the seats here, his big head resting on Mara's foot. She looked up when he stopped at a row. "Ma'am," Silas said. He kept his voice even, but he heard something underneath it, something he hadn't heard in his own voice in a long time. "I need to ask you something, and I apologize for the interruption." She waited. The book was closed. Her hands were in her lap. "That dog," he said. "The tag says Eli Rourke." Nothing moved in her face. But something shifted behind her eyes. A very small thing, like a door that was being held shut with significant effort. "He was Eli's," she said. "Yes." "How do you have him?" A pause. The engines were changing pitch. They were about to push back. "It's a long story," she said. "How long?" She looked at him steadily. 7 years. Silas leaned one hand against the overhead bin. He was a man who had commanded battalions, who had briefed joint task forces at 0200 in places without names, who had made split-second decisions that changed the shape of people's lives. Right now he had approximately no idea what to say. "I knew Eli," he said finally. Something crossed her face, just briefly. The flicker of something that didn't have a clean name. Not grief exactly, not surprise, not the performance of either. Just an acknowledgement, like she'd been carrying a very heavy box and someone had just placed their hand briefly on the side of it. "I know," she said. "You spoke at his service. I watched the recording." Silas stared at her. "You were there?" "No." She looked down at Viper, ran her thumb along the edge of his scar without thinking about it. "I wasn't anywhere by then." He wanted to ask. He had 15 more questions stacking up behind the first one, and he was a man who had never been comfortable leaving a question unasked. But the flight attendant was moving through the aisle now, asking everyone to be seated for pushback. Silas caught his briefing. He had no choice. He straightened up, looked at her one more time. "I'd like to continue this conversation," he said. "When we're at altitude." She looked back out the window. The jet bridge was retracting. "Sure," she said. "Like it didn't matter either way." Silas went back to his seat. He sat down, buckled, stared at the seat back in front of him. Eli Rourke's dog. 7 years after Eli's death, with a woman nobody in this entire aircraft had thought worth looking at twice. He pulled out his phone before the cabin crew made him switch to airplane mode, opened his contacts, pulled up Warren Pike's number. He typed, "Who is she?" And then he turned off his phone. The fastened seatbelt light clicked off at cruising altitude. Silas was reaching for his seatbelt buckle. He was going to go back, was going to ask every single question, when he heard it. Not loud, not dramatic. A sound. Coming from further back in the cabin. A low, labored sound, like a bellow with the volume turned almost all the way down. Rhythmic, wrong. The kind of sound that experienced people hear and immediately begin calculating. It was Viper. Mara heard it at the same moment. She was already out of her seat, already in the aisle, moving toward the sound with a kind of efficiency that had nothing to do with hurrying. Every step placed, economical, no wasted motion. The grocery bag abandoned, the paperback abandoned. Just her, moving. She dropped to her knees in the aisle next to Viper. Her hands went to him immediately, left hand flat against the rib cage, 2 fingers of her right hand at the underside of his jaw. The dog's breathing was labored, high, shallow, wrong. "Hey," she said it quietly, her face 3 inches from his. "Hey, I've got you. I've got you." She pressed her fingers against the scar tissue below his ribs. She felt it, the subtle difference in resistance there, the place where the old fragment had shifted. "Oh no," she said softly, to herself, to Viper, to nobody. "Oh no, not here." She looked up at the flight attendant, Cassidy, who had appeared at the end of the aisle, watching with that expression people get when something is happening and they don't know what role they're supposed to play. "Medical kit," Mara said. "Now. And I need oxygen, whatever you have on board." For the dog, medical kit." Her voice didn't rise, but it changed. Something happened to the register of it. It got cleaner, straighter, like a radio signal locking onto a frequency. "Oxygen. Now." Cassidy hesitated 1 second. Then Silas Mercer stood up in row 7 and said one word to the entire cabin with the voice of a man who had spent 30 years being obeyed. "Move." Cassidy moved. And Mara Vance, the quiet woman in the burned jacket, the woman who had been asked to leave first class for looking too ordinary, the woman nobody on this aircraft had thought worth a second glance, pressed both hands against the rib cage of Eli Rourke's dying dog. And became someone else entirely. Her face went still in a way that was different from quiet. It was the stillness of absolute concentration. Every part of her that had been soft, deflecting, invisible, gone. In its place, something that Silas recognized instantly because he had only ever seen it on one kind of person, the kind who had done this before, in worse places, when the stakes were not a dog. "Come on," she said quietly, and her hands were steadier than the altitude, steadier than the engines, steadier than anything in that cabin had any right to be. "Come on, you've done this before. You've been through worse." The dog wheezed, and the couple from first class, the woman in the silk blouse, the man with the silver hair and the good tan, peered through the gap in the curtain and said, "Is someone going to deal with this, or—" Mara did not look up. Her hands did not stop moving, and somewhere in the back of his throat, Silas Mercer made a sound that was not quite a word and pressed his palm flat against the curtain to hold it shut. Silas held the curtain shut with his palm flat against the fabric and did not move. On the other side of it, he could hear the woman, the one with the silk blouse, saying something to her husband in a low, irritated voice. He couldn't make out the words, and he didn't try. He kept his hand on the curtain and his eyes on Mara, and he breathed through his nose the way he had learned to breathe in situations where the air itself felt unreliable. Mara was still on her knees. The medical kit had arrived, a red hard-shell case that Cassidy set down open on the seat beside the aisle, her hands hovering uselessly above it because she clearly had no idea what Mara would need and was smart enough not to pretend otherwise. The oxygen unit was a compact portable canister with a pediatric mask attached, because that was all they had, and Mara had already swapped the mask out and was working with the tubing directly, angling the flow low and controlled against Viper's muzzle without fully covering his face. She'd done that without being asked, without explaining why. Silas knew why. A full mask on a panicked dog was a fight you didn't want. You kept the oxygen close without triggering the instinct to pull away. It was the kind of knowledge that didn't come from a manual. "His breathing is getting shallower," she said. Not to anyone in particular, just saying it, processing out loud the way surgeons sometimes did when they needed the information in the air rather than just in their heads. "Is there a vet on board?" Cassidy asked. "I don't need a vet," Mara said. Ma'am, I need a second pair of hands, and I need everyone else to back up. She looked up then, briefly, at the small half circle of passengers who had gathered at the edge of the aisle. Not angry, just clear. Please. People backed up. Silas stayed. He crouched down on the opposite side of Viper, keeping his body low and his movement slow, and looked at Mara across the dog's rib cage. Tell me what you need, he said. She looked at him for 1 second, assessing. Then she said, hold his head, both hands. Keep him still, but don't pin him. If he tries to lift up, let him, then bring him back down gently. Got it. Don't talk to him, don't make eye contact, just pressure. Silas placed both hands on either side of Viper's skull, thumbs resting just above the jaw, fingers spread along the top of his head. The dog's muscles were rigid, trembling slightly. The kind of trembling that wasn't fear, it was the body working too hard. Mara pressed both palms against Viper's left rib cage, fingers spread, feeling. What she was doing wasn't in any standard protocol Silas had ever seen. It wasn't massage. It wasn't CPR. It was something more precise than either. A kind of deliberate, measured pressure applied in a sequence that changed every few seconds, her fingertips moving in small increments like she was reading something written inside the tissue. What is it? Silas asked. Low, private. Old fragment. Metal. It shifted under the altitude pressure. Her hands didn't stop moving. When he was wounded, the surgeons couldn't get all of it. It was too close to the lung wall. They left the smaller pieces and monitored. She paused, pressed harder at a specific point, held for 3 seconds. Nobody monitored. Silas said nothing. The pressure change at altitude compressed the cavity here. She indicated with her chin without lifting her hands. The fragment moved. It's not puncturing anything yet, but it's crowding the space. He can't fully expand. Yet, Silas said. Yet, she agreed. He watched her work. The cabin around them had gone into that particular suspended state that happens when something serious is occurring and nobody knows their role. People in their seats, faces turned, conversations dead. The white noise of the engine suddenly very loud. Cassidy appeared at Silas's shoulder. The captain is asking if we need to divert. How long to Salt Lake? When Mara asked without looking up. Hour 40. A beat. No diversion, Mara said. If he holds the next 10 minutes, he'll hold the flight. And if he doesn't? She didn't answer that. Cassidy went back to the front. 7 minutes passed. Silas kept his hand steady on Viper's head and watched Mara work and didn't ask any more questions because there was a version of helping that looked like talking and a version that looked like shutting up, and he knew which one this was. On the 5th minute, Viper's breathing changed, still labored, still not right, but the high, strained quality of it had shifted down half a register, less a wheeze, more a deep, effortful pull. Like a man coming up from underwater who was still winded but had found the surface. Mara let out a breath. She didn't stop what she was doing, but something in her shoulders changed, not relaxing, but recalibrating. Okay, she said quietly. To Viper. Okay, that's better. That's better. Viper's pale eyes found her face. The trembling in his muscles slowed. From behind the curtain, clear and completely unaware of how it would land, the woman's voice came through. Can someone please tell me how much longer this is going to go on? We paid for a certain level of... Silas felt Mara's jaw tighten. He saw it, the small clench along the hinge of it, there and gone. She kept her hands on the dog. Silas stood up slowly, turned to face the curtain, and pulled it back 2 feet. The woman was standing just on the other side, arms crossed, blouse still immaculate. Her husband was back in his seat, looking at his phone again. The body language of a man who had learned that the most comfortable position in a domestic argument was wherever you weren't. Sir, the woman started, looking at Silas. We're dealing with a medical situation, Silas said. His voice was the same tone he'd used to brief generals. Flat, final. No invitation to continue. I'm asking you to return to your seat. It's a dog. Yes. I'm just trying to understand why the entire cabin has to... It's a military working dog, Silas said, and the woman treating him is the reason he's alive. So I'm going to ask you one more time to sit down. The woman stared at him. You don't have any authority to... No, he agreed. I don't. You're right. He held the curtain steady and looked at her. I'm just asking, nicely. Something about the way he said it, the specific flatness of it, the absolute absence of any interest in her reaction, made her take one step back. She turned, made a small private sound of offense to her husband, and sat down. Silas let the curtain fall. He went back to his crouch beside Viper. She's going to complain to the airline, Mara said. She hadn't turned around. Her hands were still moving. She'll live, Silas said. The corner of Mara's mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. Something close to it. How long has it been? He asked. 11 minutes. And? She pressed her palm flat against the ribcage one more time, held it, felt. Then she sat back on her heels and let her hands rest on her thighs. He's stable, she said. For now. The word sat there between them. For now, Silas repeated. He needs an actual vet when we land. Imaging. Probably surgery to relocate the fragment or get it out. She reached out and ran her thumb along the edge of Viper's scar. That unconscious motion she kept making, that small reflex that told you more about her relationship to this dog and what he represented than anything she'd said. But he'll make the flight. How do you know? She looked at Viper. Because he's stubborn. He's always been stubborn. Silas sat down on the floor of the aisle, properly sat, back against the seat base, legs in front of him. He was 61 years old and his knees were going to remind him of this decision for a week, and he didn't care. You treated him before, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd known it since the moment she dropped into the aisle, and her hands went to that scar without searching for it. She hadn't looked for the scar. She'd known exactly where it was. Mara looked at him sideways. Yeah, she said. When? She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the cabin was slowly beginning to breathe again. People turning back to their screens, the low murmur of conversation returning. Cassidy was moving down the aisle, checking on passengers, giving them the polite nod that said, everything's fine, nothing to see. 7 years ago, Mara said, the operation. I don't know what operation you're referring to, she said. And the way she said it was not evasive, it was precise. The specific phrasing of someone who had learned very thoroughly that there were conversations you did not have. Silas understood. He'd had the same conversations. Were you medical? He asked instead. Pararescue, she said. Then, like she was correcting herself, former. The word landed differently than it should have. Former. Like taking off a piece of clothing you'd worn for so long it had started to feel like skin. Silas looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the jacket, not the bag, not the surface of her. The way her hands had moved. The way she'd assessed the kit and immediately bypassed half of it. The specific angle she'd held the oxygen line. The way she'd said, I don't need a vet not with arrogance, but with the quiet authority of someone who had made that calculation and already knew the answer. Pararescue attached to what unit? He asked. She looked at him for a beat. You know I'm not going to answer that. I know, he said. I asked anyway. She almost smiled again. Colonel Mercer, right? I heard your name when the attendant addressed you. Silas. She nodded but didn't offer anything back. He already knew her name from the ticket. The gate agent had confirmed 3A under Vance. But names weren't the same as information, and information was what he didn't have. Viper shifted, put his head on Mara's knee. She put her hand on top of his head and left it there. How long have you had him? Silas asked. 4 days. He blinked. 4 days. General Pike brought him to the diner where I work 3 nights ago. She said it without any particular emotion, but he heard the strangeness of it, the gap between pararescue medic and diner sitting there like a ditch neither of them acknowledged. Viper had failed every placement they'd tried. 3 different handlers over 7 years, none of them stuck. She paused. When Pike brought him in, he crossed the entire floor and sat on my feet. Wouldn't move. Silas looked at the dog. Viper's eyes were half closed now, breathing slow and deep, exhausted. But the color that had been going out of his gums 20 minutes ago was back. Dogs don't forget, Silas said. No, she agreed. They don't. What did you do? When Pike brought him to you. Stood there. She rubbed Viper's ear absently. Told Pike I couldn't take a dog. I work doubles. I live in a studio that doesn't allow pets. The lease is month to month. A pause. He said he'd handle the lease. Pike always handles things. Yeah? There was something dry in her voice, not unkind, just the recognition of a certain kind of general. He'd already bought the plane ticket by the time I woke up the next morning. There was an envelope under the door of my apartment with the itinerary, Viper's full medical records, and a note that said to be at the airport by 6. Just like that. Just like that. Silas looked at the ceiling of the cabin for a moment, the recycled air, the hum of altitude. Why Salt Lake City? He asked. She took a beat too long, not long enough that a stranger would notice, long enough that Silas did. Pike has contacts there, she said. A vet who specializes in retired MWDs. For Viper. And for you? She didn't answer. He let it sit. The fastened seatbelt sign chimed on briefly, then off. Turbulence that didn't materialize. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Smooth, bored, the professionally pleasant voice of someone who had been doing this long enough that his resting state was mild reassurance. Folks, we're going to be cruising at 38,000 feet for the remainder of the flight. Should have you on the ground in Salt Lake in about 70 minutes. Flight attendants will be coming through with service shortly. Mara looked at the speaker in the ceiling like she'd forgotten the rest of the world was operating normally. 70 minutes, she said. You'll make it, Silas said. She looked at him. You sound sure. You sound sure, he said. So I am. Something shifted in her expression. It was subtle and quick, and then it was gone. The barest trace of something that looked like it might have been gratitude, except she clearly wasn't comfortable with gratitude, and so it hadn't gotten more than a half second of real estate on her face before she looked back down at the dog. Cassidy appeared again, quieter this time, moving carefully like she was approaching something that might startle. Can I get either of you anything? Water? We have... Water would be great, Silas said. Mara said nothing, but when Cassidy came back with 2 bottles, she opened hers and drank half of it immediately. The kind of drinking that tells you someone forgot they were thirsty because they were busy. The curtain from first class shifted. Not the woman this time. The flight attendant from the front galley, a younger man named Derek, whose name tag Silas had read during boarding. He leaned through and looked at Mara. Ma'am, he said carefully. The captain wanted me to pass along. If there's anything you need for the remainder of the flight, we'll accommodate it. A beat. And he apologizes for the earlier situation. Mara looked at him. Tell him the dog is stable. Yes, ma'am. Derek started to pull back. And tell him I said thank you, she added, quieter. Derek nodded and disappeared. Silas watched her take another drink of water. You could have fought it, he said. The seat. You could have stood your ground. I know. But you didn't. No. Why? She thought about it. Actually thought about it, which was different from the reflexive deflection he'd been expecting. Because it wasn't worth it, she said finally. Making a scene, making them uncomfortable, making them have to figure out what to do with me. She looked at her hands. I've spent a lot of years learning that not every battle is worth the ammunition. Silas was quiet for a moment. And now? He said. She looked at Viper, who had fallen into a shallow, medicated-looking sleep. Not unconscious, just finally still. Now I'm sitting in economy, and the dog is breathing, she said. So? Silas nodded slowly. He thought about the woman across from seat 3A, the silk blouse and the practiced irritation and the absolute confidence that she had the right to be comfortable at someone else's expense. He thought about how she had looked at Mara, not with hostility exactly, not with any specific malice, but with that particular brand of dismissal that was almost worse because it was so unconscious, so fluent, like breathing. He thought about what that woman did not know, what she could not have imagined about the woman she'd had removed from the seat beside her. He wasn't going to tell her, that wasn't his place, but he was holding it, the information, the weight of it, and he was sitting with the strange ache of knowing something that would change a person's understanding of everything they'd just done, if only they knew. Mara, he said. She looked at him. What happened after the mission? She went very still, not the calm stillness, the other kind. That's a big question, she said. I know. Why do you want to know? He considered how to answer that honestly. Because I think something happened to you after it. And I think that's why you're in a diner outside Norfolk instead of... He stopped himself. Instead of what? Her voice was even, but there was an edge underneath it now. Not anger, something closer to careful. I don't know, he said honestly. I don't know what you should be doing. I just know that what I watched you do in the last 15 minutes is not something a person leaves behind. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, clouds moved below them. Thick, white, the kind that looked solid from above. The kind that didn't look like anything from the ground. I was injured, she said finally. On the extraction. Not bad enough to matter by some people's math, but... She stopped, started again. And there were decisions made during that operation that I didn't agree with, that I still don't agree with. Her hands closed around the water bottle. I finished my service. I put my papers in, and I found the quietest place I could, and I stayed there. The diner. The diner. For how long? 3 years. Silas did the math silently. She'd left the service roughly 4 years after Eli's death, and then disappeared for 3 more. Do you miss it? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Viper breathed slowly in and out. I miss being useful, she said at last. There's a difference. He understood that. He understood it in a way that was bone deep and that he'd spent considerable energy not examining too closely because the examination led to places he wasn't ready to go yet. What I told them, he said, when I spoke at Eli's service was, he paused. I talked about how good soldiers make it look easy and how the cost of that is that nobody sees what it actually cost. Mara said nothing. I've thought about that speech a lot since then, Silas said, because I meant it. And it didn't help anyone. She looked at him with an expression that was the closest thing to open she'd given him. Not warm. She wasn't a warm person, he was already sure of that. But present. Actually present with what he'd just said. No, she said. It probably didn't. A pause. But you showed up. That matters. He nodded. Around them the cabin hummed. Somewhere ahead of the curtain, the beverage cart was making its rounds in first class. The ice in the cart clicking softly against the metal sides. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary flight, 20 minutes past the thing that had not been ordinary at all. Mara reached into the pocket of her canvas jacket and pulled out the battered paperback. Looked at it for a moment, put it back. Then she reached down and adjusted the oxygen line against Viper's muzzle. A small, precise movement. Checking. Making sure. He's going to need monitoring for the rest of the flight, she said. His oxygen saturation is going to drift if I don't stay on it. I'll stay, Silas said. She looked at him sideways. You don't have to... I know, he said. She held his look for a moment, then she nodded. Just once. The kind of nod that meant something. The kind that meant, all right then. They sat in the aisle of a domestic flight with a military dog between them and the sounds of the world pressing in from every direction, and neither of them spoke for a long stretch of minutes, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of two people who had both spent a long time in places where silence meant you were still alive. 43 minutes to landing. Mara reached down and adjusted the oxygen line again, checked the placement of her hands, felt for the fragment's position through the scar tissue. Small, deliberate, professional. Then she felt something else. Her fingers went still. She pressed again, slowly, in a slightly different location from where she'd been monitoring. What? Silas said. He'd seen her face change. She didn't answer immediately. She moved her fingers again. 2 centimeters to the left, pressed, held. Mara. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd sat down in this aisle, she looked uncertain. It moved again, she said, while he was sleeping. The hum of the engines didn't change. The cabin didn't change. Nothing outside of the two of them and the dog between them changed at all, but something shifted in the air. How bad? Silas asked. She looked back at Viper. Her jaw was set. Her hands had gone back to work, repositioning, reassessing. and he could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. The brutal, clear-eyed calculus of someone totaling up a situation they didn't like the sum of. "We might have a problem," she said. "We might have a problem" was not the kind of sentence that left room for optimism. Silas had heard that sentence before, in different languages, in different time zones, in rooms where the maps on the wall had things blacked out on them. He knew what it meant. It meant the situation had just reclassified itself without asking permission. "Options," he said. Mara's hands were already moving differently. The careful monitoring pressure from before had shifted into something more active, more searching. Her face had the quality of someone reading in bad light, squinting not with her eyes, but with her concentration. "If the fragment rotates another few degrees, it's going to graze the pleural lining," she said. "That causes a pneumothorax, partial collapse." She pressed 2 fingers firmly below his last rib. Held. "He'll go into respiratory distress faster than anything I can manage up here with a pediatric oxygen line and a first aid kit built for humans." "What do you need?" "A veterinary surgical suite would be great," she said, and it was flat, not sarcastic, just the voice of someone listing what they didn't have. "What do you actually have?" She looked at the medical kit, looked at what was in it. Her eyes moved the way eyes move when someone is doing math that isn't about numbers. "Cassidy," she said. Cassidy appeared like she'd been standing by. She probably had been. She was good at her job in the way that people who had survived a lot of in-flight situations were good at their jobs. Present, watchful, not adding to the noise. "What's in the extended kit? The one for serious emergencies?" "We have a second case in the forward galley. Defibrillator, saline bags, a full tray of—" "Is there a chest seal?" Cassidy blinked. Yes, there are 2. They're for—" "I know what they're for." Mara was already on her feet. "Get it." Cassidy went. Silas looked up at Mara from the floor. "You're going to seal his chest," he said. Not a question. "I'm going to prepare to seal his chest," she said. "There's a difference. If I can stabilize the fragment position without intervention, I will. But if his breathing starts going vertical on me, I'm not going to be standing here with my hands empty because I was waiting on a permission slip." She said it without heat, completely matter of fact. The way you talked about decisions that had already been made at a deeper level than the moment. Silas stood up. His knees did exactly what he'd predicted they would do. He ignored them. From behind the curtain, the voice again. The woman. She had modulated it this time, not complaining exactly, more the tone of someone who felt they deserved an update. Reasonable on the surface, everything underneath it the same. "Can someone just tell us what's happening back there? It's been over 20 minutes, and we've heard nothing." The curtain pulled back. Not by Silas this time, by Derek, the forward flight attendant, who stepped through with the second emergency case under his arm and the expression of someone who had just made a private decision about where his loyalty sat. "We're handling a medical situation," Derek said to the cabin, loudly enough that it was clearly addressed to everyone and specifically to no one. "The crew appreciates your patience." He handed the case to Mara without a word. She took it, set it on the seat, opened it. Her hands went through it fast, not rummaging, cataloging. She'd done this before. Not this exact kit, but kits. The muscle memory of going through a medical case quickly in a bad situation had a specific quality to it, and she had it completely. She pulled out the chest seal, looked at it, set it on the seat beside her within reach. Then she went back to the floor, back to Viper, back to her hands against his rib cage, fingers spread, reading. Silas watched her settle, and he thought about what it cost someone to get this good at something. Not the training, Training was just time and repetition. The other thing, the part that happened after you'd used the training in a real situation and felt the difference between knowing a thing and knowing a thing when it was happening to a person you were responsible for keeping alive. She had that. It was written in every movement she made. 40 minutes to landing. Viper's breathing was doing something Silas didn't like the sound of. A hitch in the rhythm of it, small, intermittent, the kind of interruption that wasn't painful to listen to, but that meant something to someone who was listening for what it meant. Mara heard it at the same moment he did. "Okay," she said. Quiet, private, not to Silas. Okay, I hear you. She repositioned, moved from beside Viper to crouching over his left side. Her weight shifted forward onto her knees, both hands pressing now in a different configuration. The heel of her left hand braced against the scar site. The fingers of her right hand spread across the upper rib cage. What are you doing? Silas asked. Counter pressure. I'm trying to hold the cavity shape so the fragment can't rotate further. She breathed out slowly. I have to stay like this. How long? Until we land or until it stops working, whichever comes first. He looked at the position she was in. Forward lean, weight on her knees on the aircraft floor, both arms extended and pressing. It was not a comfortable position for 40 minutes. It was not a comfortable position for 4 minutes. Can someone relieve you? No one else knows the exact location. Can you talk me through it? She thought about that for half a second. Not without risking losing my orientation. I've been tracking this by feel for an hour. If I break contact... Understood, he said. Then I'll be here. She looked at him sideways again, that quick, assessing look. You keep saying that, she said. I keep meaning it, he said. Something moved at the front of the cabin. Not the curtain this time. The curtain parted and the woman came through it. She wasn't storming. She had decided clearly that the appropriate approach was measured, concerned even. She had restyled herself as a reasonable person checking on a situation, which somehow made it worse. I apologize for interrupting, she said, which was not an apology. But I think as paying passengers we're owed some transparency about what exactly is... Ma'am, Silas turned. No, I understand there's an animal that's unwell, and I do feel for that, I genuinely do, but the crew has not communicated anything since... Ma'am. She stopped. Something in his face had changed. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved. But something in the specific quality of his stillness had shifted, and she felt it. The woman on this floor, he said, is performing a medical procedure that requires complete concentration. Every time you speak, you take 1% of her attention. He paused. She can't spare 1%, so I'm going to ask you to go back to your seat. The woman's mouth opened. Please, he said. The word had no please in it. She went back. Derek appeared at Silas's elbow. I'm sorry, Colonel, I should have... It's fine, Silas said. No one needs to be managed. Just make sure that curtain stays closed. Yes, sir. Derek went. Silas crouched back down beside Mara. Her jaw was tight. Not from the woman, or not only from the woman. From the position. From holding her arms in a sustained press for, he checked, 16 minutes. Your arms, he said. I'm fine. Your arms are shaking. My arms are fine. They were not fine. The fine tremor in her forearms was visible from 2 feet away. Not weakness, endurance. The specific trembling of muscles that had been doing a sustained isometric task longer than muscles like to do sustained isometric tasks. You don't know where, then put my hands on top of yours, he said. I'll take the load. You keep the orientation. She started to refuse. He could see it, the automatic response of someone who was used to doing things alone, who had gotten efficient at doing things alone, who had learned that relying on another person in a critical situation was just another variable you had to manage. But her arms were shaking. And 40 minutes was 40 minutes. Okay, she said. He moved in behind her, mirroring her position, and placed his hands over hers, larger, covering them entirely. He felt the specific pressure points she was holding and bore down on them, letting his weight and his arms take what hers had been carrying. Her trembling stopped. She let out a breath through her nose. Don't shift, she said. That angle, hold exactly that angle. I've got it. If you feel a pulse under the left side, it's not a pulse. It's the fragment. Don't press harder if you feel it. Copy. She looked at him over her shoulder, a quick glance. Something in his language had registered. Military, she said. 30 years. Combat? Enough. She turned back. Her hands were still under his, guiding, but her arms had stopped shaking. The work had been redistributed. Thank you, she said. It was not a comfortable thank you. It came out of her like something she'd had to decide to say. He understood that too. Around them, the cabin had settled into a strange, suspended normalcy. People had gone back to their screens, their books, their small private worlds. The emergency had happened, and now it was continuing, and there was nothing to watch and nothing to do about it, and so most of them had located their attention elsewhere, which was a very human thing to do. A man across the aisle had been watching since the beginning, not with the morbid attention of someone seeking drama, with the focused attention of someone who was worried. He was somewhere in his 50s, wore the particular look of someone who had spent time in the outdoors professionally. He'd said nothing, but his eyes kept coming back to Viper. He caught Silas's gaze and said quietly, "You gonna make it?" Silas looked at Mara. Mara said, without turning around, "Yeah, he's gonna make it." She said it in a tone that did not allow for alternatives. The man nodded, sat back. Viper's breathing was still hitching, but the rhythm of it had not gotten worse, which meant the pressure was working, which meant they were in a holding pattern that depended entirely on these two sets of hands maintaining their exact configuration for the next, Silas checked, 34 minutes. 34 minutes was a long time. He'd been in longer holds. "Tell me something," Mara said. She was not looking at him. Her eyes were on Viper. "About what?" "Anything. I need to not be doing math right now. Just talk." He thought about that. It was such an unexpected request coming from her. This person who had not offered him a single unnecessary word since he'd sat down beside her, that it took him a moment to locate something worth saying. "I have a dog," he said. "Back home. Yellow lab, 12 years old. She sleeps on the couch even though I told her for 10 years she couldn't, and somewhere in the last 2 years I stopped telling her." She said nothing, but something in her shoulders had changed. The quality of her listening had shifted. "What's her name?" she asked. "Harper." "Why Harper?" "My daughter named her, after some book she was reading." A pause. "She was 11. My daughter. When we got Harper." He looked at the ceiling. "She's 23 now and lives in Portland and calls me every Sunday, even when she's busy." "That's good." "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, it is." They were quiet for a moment. "Eli talked about a dog," she said. It came out carefully, like picking up something fragile. "Not Viper, a dog he had growing up, some kind of hound mix, called him Senator." Silas let out a short, involuntary sound. "I never knew that." "He told me during, She stopped, started again. "We had time. While I was treating Viper. Eli was talking because I needed him to stay awake, and he told me about Senator." A pause. "He said Senator used to sleep across the foot of his bed every night, that he measured his whole childhood in that dog." Silas said nothing. "He was a good talker," she said. "When he was scared, he talked beautifully." The sentence arrived and stayed. Silas pressed his hand steady against hers and looked at Viper's slowly rising ribcage and felt the weight of what she had just given him. Not information, exactly. Something beyond information. The last 20 minutes of Eli Rourke from someone who had been there for them. "He was 26, Silas said, when he died." "I know. He'd re-upped twice. Could have gone to OCS, was too stubborn." "Yeah," she said. "He seemed like that kind. He was exactly that kind." Another silence, different from the ones before it. Fuller. The aircraft shifted. A small course correction, the wings adjusting under some invisible pressure. Silas felt Mara's hands tighten briefly under his before they released. "Steady," she said, to Viper. The dog's ear twitched. 22 minutes to landing. Cassidy came down the aisle and crouched at the edge of the scene, just outside the arm's reach of it. "Captain wants an update," she said quietly. "We're holding," Mara said. "Tell him to have a transport vehicle with a veterinary contact ready at the gate. Not a regular car. Something I can stay in the back of with the dog during transport. I'll relay that. And I need a phone that has service. Mine is on airplane mode and I need to reach Pike. We're 30 minutes from landing. FAA regulations. The dog might not have 30 minutes." She said it without drama, completely level. "I need to reach his former handler's contact. Now." Cassidy looked at Silas. He looked back at her. Cassidy stood up and walked to the front of the aircraft. She came back 90 seconds later with the crew's satellite communication handset and held it out to Mara. Mara looked at the phone, looked at her hands. Both of them occupied, both of them not available. "Dial it," she said to Silas. "It's in my jacket pocket, left side, small notebook, first number on the first page." He reached across himself awkwardly, one hand still maintaining pressure, and worked the notebook out of her pocket. Found the number. Dialed it on the satellite handset. It rang twice. A voice answered. Even through the satellite compression, it had the particular quality of someone who was always awake and never fully off duty. "Pike. General, this is Colonel Silas Mercer. I'm on a flight with Mara Vance and Viper. We have a medical situation." A beat. "Just one." Then, "How bad?" "Manageable for now. She needs a vet team at the Salt Lake arrival gate, possible pneumothorax, fragment migration." "I know the fragment," Pike said, and his voice had gone sharp in the way that voices go sharp when information confirms something already feared. "I'll have Reyes there. Dr. Reyes, she knows Viper's file. Tell Mara to keep the pressure where she has it." Silas looked at Mara. "He says keep the pressure where you have it." "Tell him I know," she said. "She knows," Silas said. "Tell her—" A pause on the line. Something shifting in Pike's voice, something that didn't quite make it all the way out. "Tell her he made the right call, sending the dog to her." Silas relayed it. Mara's expression didn't change, but her jaw worked once, very briefly, like she was deciding whether to say something and then deciding not to. "Tell him we'll be on the ground in 20, she said. Silas relayed it, ended the call, handed the satellite phone back to Cassidy. They held the position, 15 minutes, 10. Viper's breathing was still wrong, but it was consistent, the same quality of wrong it had been for the last 20 minutes, which meant the pressure was containing it, which meant they'd gotten lucky, or Mara had gotten it exactly right. And from what Silas had observed in the last 90 minutes, those were not always different things. At 7 minutes to landing, the cabin crew made their descent announcement. People began stowing tray tables, putting away screens, the ordinary choreography of arrival. Nobody asked Mara and Silas to move. At 5 minutes, the aircraft began its descent and the pressure change in the cabin shifted, and Mara made a small, fast adjustment with her hands, a few degrees, a half-inch of repositioning. And Silas followed her exactly without asking, because he had learned in the last 40 minutes what her hands were telling him, and he followed them the way you follow a guide in the dark, without seeing where you're going, trusting that they know. Viper's breathing changed. Better. Not good, but better. The hitch in it smoothed out by maybe 30%. The descent pressure was doing something different to the cavity than the cruising altitude had done, changing the calculation. "That's good," Mara said, almost to herself. "That's okay. Okay." Her hands didn't come off him, but the set of her shoulders released something that had been wound very tight for a very long time. The wheels touched down at Salt Lake City International with a bump and a roar of reverse thrust that shook the cabin and caused Viper to lift his head, the first voluntary movement he'd made in 40 minutes, and look at Mara. She was right there, 3 inches from his face. "I know," she said. "I know. We're down." His tail moved, once, slow, like something that took the last of a reserve he'd been rationing. Silas sat back on his heels and let his arms drop. His hands were numb from the wrists down. He didn't mention it. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the curtain from first class pulled back and the woman stood there. And this time her face was different. It was the face of someone who had been sitting on the other side of a curtain for 90 minutes, listening to something she hadn't fully understood, and was now standing in the fact of it. She looked at Mara. Mara was checking Viper's gum color, lifting his lip gently with her thumb, leaning close, her focus absolute. She didn't look up. The woman's mouth opened. Silas looked at her and shook his head. Once. Not unkind. Just clear. Not now. The woman closed her mouth. She stood there for another moment, holding the curtain, looking at the woman on the floor of the aircraft with both hands on a dog, and a medical case open beside her, and a burn mark on the cuff of her jacket. And then she let the curtain fall. The boarding bridge connected with a clank. Cassidy came down the aisle and crouched beside them. "There's a vehicle at the gate," she said. "Dr. Reyes is there, and—" She paused. "The captain asked me to tell you that you're welcome to deplane first." Mara looked up. For the first time since the aircraft had touched down, she looked like someone who was aware there were other people in the world. "Thank you," she said. She said it the same way she'd said it before, with the weight of someone who didn't say it easily. Cassidy nodded and stood, and Silas heard something in the silence of it that was bigger than the moment. Mara looked down at Viper. She put her hand flat on his side one more time, felt his breathing, felt the slow, exhausted, still wrong but still present rise and fall of it. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's go." She gathered him up, not lifting, supporting, the way you'd moved a wounded person who could still bear some of their own weight. And Silas was on his feet and helping before she asked, and neither of them said anything about it. They came down the aisle of the aircraft and through the door and into the jet bridge, and the fluorescent light of the boarding tunnel was harsh and flat after the recirculated air of the plane. And Mara was focused entirely on the dog in her arms and the weight of him and the sound of his breathing. She did not look back at the cabin. She did not look at the couple in first class. She walked forward. At the end of the jet bridge, the gate area opened up into the terminal, and standing there 50 feet away was General Warren Pike. Not just Pike. Beside him stood a woman in a medical vest who was already moving toward them with a portable monitoring unit in her hands, and behind her, two people Silas didn't recognize, both in civilian clothes, both standing the way military people stood when they were trying not to look like military people, and failing. And beside Pike, there was something else. A sealed envelope, held in his hand at his side. Pike's eyes went to Mara immediately. Went to Viper. Did a rapid assessment in the way that a general did rapid assessments, taking in everything visible in about 2 seconds and calculating. Then his eyes went to Silas, and he looked at Silas with an expression that Silas had not seen on Warren Pike's face in 30 years of knowing him. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and was looking at the person who was finally going to have to know what it was. Dr. Reyes reached them before Pike did. She was mid-40s, compact, with the kind of efficient movement that said she had spent years in spaces where moving slowly cost something. She had a portable pulse oximeter in one hand and a stethoscope already around her neck, and she went straight to Viper without preamble, without introduction, without any of the social choreography that the situation didn't have room for. "What are we looking at?" she said to Mara. Not to Pike, not to Silas, to Mara, like she already knew who the relevant person was. Old fragment, lower left rib cage, approximately 2 centimeters below the original wound site, Mara said. She was still supporting Viper's weight, both arms under him, and her voice had the quality of someone giving a handoff report. Clipped. Sequential. No wasted syllables. "It migrated under altitude pressure during flight. I've been maintaining counterpressure for the last 40 minutes. Breathing improved on descent, but it's still compromised. He needs imaging immediately. The fragment may have rotated. I couldn't confirm tactilely." Reyes had the stethoscope on Viper's chest before Mara finished the sentence. She listened, moved the head of it 2 inches, listened again. "Left lung is diminished," she said. "Not absent, diminished." "I know." "You contained it." "I tried." Reyes looked up from the dog for the first time and looked at Mara directly. It was a quick look, assessment grade, the kind that a person gave when they were recalibrating their expectations. "You did more than try," she said. "Come on, I've got a vehicle outside." They moved. Pike fell into step beside Mara, matching her pace, and Silas moved on her other side, and nobody said anything for the length of the gate area because Mara was focused on the dog, and the dog was focused on breathing, and everything else was secondary. The two people in civilian clothes moved ahead to clear the path. Silas watched them work, the subtle angling of bodies, the way they positioned without drawing attention, and felt the shape of what he was in the middle of become slightly clearer. This had been planned, not improvised. Pike had not driven to Salt Lake City alone on 4 days' notice. The vehicle was an SUV with the back seats folded down. Reyes had lined it with a padded mat and had a portable oxygen unit already mounted. Mara got in the back with Viper without being asked. Reyes followed. The door closed. Silas stood on the curb. Pike stood beside him. They watched the SUV pull away, and then they stood there for a moment in the particular way that two men stood when they had a lot to say to each other, and neither of them had decided how to start. Pike was 73. He had the build of someone who had once been physically formidable and had become merely solid, like a structure that had shed everything unnecessary. His hair was white. His eyes were the kind of blue that had faded from something darker over decades of looking at things he couldn't change. "She saved him," Pike said. "Not a question." "She saved him twice," Silas said. "Once on the ground and once in the air." Pike nodded slowly, like he was filing it. "How'd she do?" "Under pressure?" Silas looked at the space where the SUV had been. "She was the calmest person on that aircraft. Including me." "Including you," Pike said. A note in it that wasn't quite amusement, something drier. "I need you to tell me who she is," Silas said. "The real answer, not the file answer." Pike looked at him sideways. "Those are usually the same thing." "Not with her." A pause. Pike reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a cigar he didn't light. Just held it, the old habit of a man who had given up the habit, but not the gesture. "She was assigned to the 24th Special Tactics Squadron," Pike said. "Pararescue. Cross-attached to a classified recovery element operating under JSOC authority." He looked at the arrivals lane. "The mission where Eli Rourke died was a personnel recovery. 2 downed pilots and an agency asset, urban environment. Not friendly." Silas knew the broad outlines. He had clearance for the broad outlines. The details had always been someone else's problem. "She went in with a 4-man team," Pike continued. "By the time they reached the pilots, the extraction route was compromised. She treated 2 casualties under fire, got both pilots to the exfil point." He paused. "Rourke was providing security with Viper when the secondary device detonated. Viper took fragmentation. Rourke took more." Silas said nothing. "She went back," Pike said. "After the pilots were clear. Standard protocol said you don't go back. The route was hot, the exfil window was closing, and her team leader told her to hold. She went back anyway. She was back in that building for 53 minutes. Pike turned the unlit cigar between his fingers. "She kept Viper alive, and she stayed with Rourke until—" He stopped. "Until she could confirm he was gone. Then she brought the dog out." The airport noise continued around them. Taxis, announcements, the ordinary machinery of people coming and going. "She was written up," Silas said. "She was written up," Pike confirmed. "Insubordination. Deviation from tactical protocol. Her team leader was a man who believed that rules existed because people who didn't follow them got other people killed." He paused. "He wasn't wrong, as a general principle. But she saved the dog, and she didn't leave Eli alone." Pike's jaw shifted. Those aren't things that appear in an insubordination report in a flattering light. What happened to the report? "It exists. In a file, in a drawer somewhere inside a building that doesn't have a sign outside it." Pike put the cigar back in his pocket. "Her service record shows an honorable discharge. No commendations for that operation. No acknowledgement. The classification covered everything." Silas absorbed this. 7 years. She had carried the weight of a decision that saved a dog and honored a dying soldier, and the institution she made that decision for had filed it in an unmarked drawer and sent her home. "And then she disappeared," Silas said. "Not immediately. She served another 14 months. Then she put her papers in." Pike looked at him. "Her CO at the time said she'd become difficult. Withdrawn. Non-compliant during evaluations. Refused a commendation ceremony for a different operation." He paused. "In retrospect, those are not the signs of someone who is difficult. Those are the signs of someone who is done." Silas thought about the diner. The 3 years of coffee and double shifts in a studio apartment with a month-to-month lease, the canvas grocery bag, the burned jacket. "She's been carrying all of it alone," he said. "Yes." "And you waited 3 years to find her." Pike's expression shifted. Not defensively. It was something older than defensiveness. The expression of a man who knew he had done something too late and was not going to pretend otherwise. It took time to get clearance to reopen the records enough to locate her, he said. Some of that is bureaucracy, and some of that is... He stopped. Some of that is that I should have pushed harder, and I didn't. It was the most honest thing Silas had ever heard Warren Pike say. He'd known the man for 30 years, and he'd heard him speak at Senate hearings and command briefings and memorial services, and this four-word admission, I should have pushed, landed differently than all of it. There's something else, Silas said. That envelope. Pike looked at him. Then he reached inside his jacket and produced it. It was a standard manila envelope, sealed, with nothing written on the outside. Eli's family, Pike said. His mother. She's been trying to find the medic who was with him for 7 years. Classification prevented me from giving her a name. He held the envelope. Last month, the legal office gave me a narrow window, enough to confirm that the individual was civilian, was no longer operating under classification restriction, and could be contacted. You wrote her a letter. She wrote the letter. I'm delivering it. Silas looked at the envelope. Does Mara know it's coming? No. Pike, I know, Pike said. I know. The veterinary facility was 20 minutes from the airport, a specialist practice that Reyes operated out of, equipped for exactly the kind of case that didn't get discussed in ordinary veterinary circles. The SUV pulled into the back entrance, and they moved Viper inside on a low gurney that Reyes had ready, and the doors swung shut, and there was nothing to do but wait. Silas and Pike sat in a small waiting area that smelled like antiseptic and had plastic chairs that were designed for function rather than the comfort of people who were in bad situations. There was a coffee machine in the corner that produced something that was technically coffee in the same way that a parking lot was technically outdoor space. Silas got 2 cups and handed one to Pike, and they sat with them for a while without speaking. At the 40-minute mark, Mara came out. She was alone. She'd washed her hands. Silas could see the waterline on her jacket cuffs where she'd been thorough about it. Her face was the particular blank of someone who had just been through something that required everything they had and was now on the other side of it and didn't quite know what to do with their face without a task. She looked at Pike. Pike stood up. He's in surgery, she said. Reyes got the imaging. The fragment had rotated about 30 degrees. She says she can get it out cleanly. A pause. She says if it had gone another 20 degrees, it would have been a different conversation. But it didn't, Pike said. No. Because you held it. She said nothing. Pike looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Sit down, Mara. She sat, not because he told her to. Silas had already understood that she didn't take instructions reflexively, but because her legs had made the decision before her pride could object. She'd been running on reserves for hours, and the reserves had just filed their notice. Pike sat across from her. Silas stayed where he was, slightly apart, and said nothing, because this was not his conversation. He was a witness to it, that was all. I owe you an explanation, Pike said. You owe me a lot of things, Mara said. Not angry, just accurate. Yes, he said. I do. She looked at him. There was something in her face that was not quite ready to be open and not quite able to be closed anymore. Like a door that had been shut for a long time and had swollen in the frame, and the choice to open it or keep it shut had become equally difficult. Why now? She said. Because the records opened. They opened because you pushed them open. You told me that yourself 3 nights ago. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it that had been waiting a long time to be said. So I'll ask again, why now? Why not 2 years ago? Why not 4? Pike didn't look away. Because 4 years ago, I was still trying to do it inside the system, through channels, following protocol. A pause. And the system was not interested in being followed. So you just, what? Waited. I kept pushing, he said. It didn't look like much from the outside, I know that. It looked like nothing from the outside, she said. Silence. You're right, Pike said. It looked like nothing, and you were at a diner and Viper was in his 4th failed placement, and he stopped. And I should have found a way to get it done faster. I know that. I'm not asking you to forgive the timeline. I'm telling you what it was. Mara looked at her hands. They were steady now. They'd been steady for hours. But there was something in the way she looked at them, like she was checking on them, making sure they were still hers. Tell me about the letter, she said. Pike looked at her sharply. Silas told you. Nobody told me anything. You've been holding something in your inside pocket since the gate, and you keep almost reaching for it. She looked at him flatly. I spent 3 years watching people in a diner. I know what it looks like when someone is about to say something and keeps deciding not to. Pike produced the envelope. He held it out. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at it for a moment, at the plain manila surface of it, at the nothing written on the outside. From Eli's family, Pike said. Her jaw moved. His mother, Pike said. She's been trying to find you since... I know, Mara said. I know she has. Pike stared at her. You knew. She put a notice in a veteran's publication about 2 years after Eli died. She described the medic, the operation, the dog. Mara looked at the envelope. I saw it. And you didn't... I was still classified, she said. The publication was informal enough that... I know. Her voice had gone quieter. I know it was informal enough. I know I could probably have found a way. She picked up the envelope, didn't open it, just held it. I wasn't ready. The plastic chair under her creaked as she shifted. I wasn't ready, she said again, quieter. To be that person. The one who was there. Because being that person meant... She stopped. The sentence didn't finish out loud, but Silas thought he could hear the shape of it. Being that person meant the night was real. Meant Eli was real and gone, and she had been the last one there, and the weight of that didn't get lighter by being acknowledged. It got heavier. She turned the envelope over in her hands once. Then she set it on her knee and left it there. What does the letter say? She asked. I haven't read it, Pike said. She looked at him. It was written for you, he said simply. Another silence. Different from the ones on the plane, less tense, more vast, like a space that had been crowded for years and someone had just removed a wall. From the back room, the muffled sounds of Reyes working, the clean, methodical sounds of a procedure going according to plan. The two people at the gate, Mara said. The ones in civilian clothes. Who are they? Pike glanced at Silas, and Silas had the sense of watching a man decide how much of a long story to tell. They're from the legal office that processed the records clearance, Pike said. There are some documents that require your signature, related to the formal transfer of Viper's custody and, he paused, and related to a commendation that was held in abeyance. Mara went very still. No, she said. Mara. No. Her voice hadn't risen. It was still quiet. But it had changed quality. It had become the voice from the aircraft. The one that didn't negotiate. I didn't do what I did for a commendation. I did it because Eli was dying, and his dog was dying, and I wasn't going to leave either of them. You don't put a ribbon on that. The commendation isn't for you to display, Pike said carefully. It's for the record, so that the official version of what happened that night says what actually happened, instead of what was convenient to put in the file. She was quiet. There's a difference, he said, between honoring yourself and correcting a lie. It landed. Silas saw it land. The small shift in her expression that meant something had gotten through. She didn't agree, but she didn't say no again. I want to see Reyes first, she said. When she's done. Of course. And I want to read the letter before I sign anything. That's not a condition anyone would argue with, Pike said. She nodded once. Then she looked at Silas across the waiting room, and he had the sense of someone turning to include a person they'd almost forgotten was there. Not because they'd dismissed him, but because she was unused to being accompanied. Thank you, she said, for the aircraft. You would have managed, he said. Maybe. She looked at the envelope on her knee. Maybe not. It was the most uncertain thing he'd heard her say. Not weakness, just honesty. The specific honesty of someone who had just spent several hours running at full capacity and was willing, now that it was over, to acknowledge that capacity had a ceiling. There's one more thing, Pike said. Mara looked at him. Eli's mother asked. In the letter, she explains this herself, but I want to prepare you. She asked if you would be willing to speak with her. At some point, when you're ready. He paused. No timeline, no pressure. She understands the classification history. She just wants to hear about him, Mara said. Yes. She looked at the envelope again. The door to the back room opened and Reyes appeared, pulling her gloves off in that specific way surgeons did when a procedure was finished and had gone the way it was supposed to go. He's out, she said. Fragment is out. Lung is reinflating well. He'll need to rest and he'll need monitoring, but she looked at Mara directly. He's going to be fine, significantly due to the fact that someone kept him alive for 40 minutes at altitude with field-improvised counterpressure. Mara stood up. Can I see him? He's sedated. I know. Can I see him? Reyes looked at her for a moment, then stepped aside from the door. Mara went through. The room smelled like antiseptic and oxygen and the specific clean smell of post-surgical equipment. Viper was on a padded table, a small monitoring unit clipped to his toe, an IV line in his foreleg. His rib cage moved steadily, slowly, without the hitching, without the strained quality that had been in it for the last several hours. Just breathing. Mara sat in the chair beside the table, put her hand on his head, same as always. Not holding, just there. The position of someone who had made a particular kind of promise and was checking in on it. She held the envelope in her other hand. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she opened it. Silas didn't follow her into the room. Neither did Pike. They stood at the door for a moment, and then by unspoken agreement they moved back to the waiting area and left her alone with the dog and the letter and whatever was about to come apart inside her quietly in a room that smelled like antiseptic and healing. She's going to be all right, Silas said. Not to Pike, mostly to himself. She's been all right, Pike said. She's been all right all along. She just didn't have anywhere to put it. Through the window in the door he could see her. She'd unfolded the letter. She was reading. Her face was turned down and away from the door, and he couldn't see her expression, but he could see her shoulders. The set of them, that particular brace she'd been carrying since he'd first watched her stand up from seat 3A with her grocery bag and her dog and her complete absence of performance. As he watched, that brace began, slowly, almost imperceptibly, to come undone, just slightly, just enough. Outside, Salt Lake City was doing what it did at midday in July, sitting under a sky that was too large and too blue for the things happening beneath it. The mountains were where they always were. The airport traffic had not stopped. The ordinary world had continued exactly as it always did, regardless of what happened inside it. In the waiting room, Pike reached into his jacket pocket and produced the unlit cigar again, turned it in his fingers, put it back. You're going to tell me, Silas said, what's actually in those documents, the ones that need her signature. I told you, custody transfer, commendation. And? A pause. There's a program, Pike said carefully, veteran-led, focused on retired service animals and the handlers who need them, reintegration work, civilian transition. He looked at the window in the door. It needs someone who understands both sides of that equation, the animal side and the human side. Another pause. It has funding. It has a facility. It has a staff. He looked at Silas. It doesn't have a director. Silas looked at him. You didn't come here just for the dog, he said. The dog needed to come regardless, Pike said. That part was real. But I've been watching her pour coffee for 3 years, Pike said. And I've been watching a program sit without the right person to run it, and at a certain point the math becomes difficult to ignore. Silas looked at the window in the door. Inside, Mara was still reading. She had reached the end of the letter. He could tell by the angle of the page, and she had not moved. She was sitting with it, whatever it had said, sitting with it the way you sat with something that weighed the right amount. She's going to say no, Silas said. Probably, Pike said. At first. And then? Pike looked at the window. And then she's going to think about it, he said. And she's going to look at the dog. And she's going to remember that she spent 3 years in a diner feeling like the thing she was good at had been taken away from her. He paused. And she's going to realize that it wasn't. It was just waiting. Through the door, Mara folded the letter slowly and carefully and set it on the edge of the table beside Viper's paw. She put her hand back on the dog's head. She sat very straight in the chair. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry. She was not the kind of person who cried in front of windows. But something in the line of her had changed. Something that had been locked had moved. Silas could see it from 20 feet away through a pane of glass, and he couldn't explain exactly what he was looking at, only that it was real and it was significant, and it was the kind of change that didn't announce itself, the kind that just quietly rearranged everything that came after it. She sat with the letter for a long time. Reyes had dimmed the surgical lights and left a single lamp on near the monitoring station, so the room had gone warm and quiet, and the only sounds were the soft electronic pulse of Viper's heart rate on the monitor and the low mechanical breath of the oxygen assist cycling down as his lungs took over more of their own work. He was doing it on his own now, slowly, carefully, like a man testing his weight on a healing leg, but doing it. Mara had read the letter twice. She knew she'd read it twice because the paper had been folded and unfolded, and there were new crease lines that hadn't been there before, slightly off from the original folds, the way paper looked when someone had handled it with hands that weren't entirely steady. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten. Margaret Rourke had a teacher's handwriting, deliberate, slightly right-leaning, the kind that had been practiced on lined paper for decades. She did not write the way people wrote when they were performing grief. She wrote the way people wrote when they had been waiting a very long time to say something and had finally been given the address to send it to. She wrote about Eli as a boy first, the way he'd made his bed with military corners at age 9 because he'd seen it in a movie and decided that was how things should be done. The way he'd argued with her about everything from dinner to curfew with such specific, structured logic that she'd started wondering if she was raising a lawyer or a general, and how he'd looked at her when she asked and said, straight-faced, "Neither one of those sounds like any fun, Mom." She wrote about the dog, how Eli had written home about Viper in every letter after their first deployment together, how he'd described the dog working, the way Viper moved through a building, how he communicated, how Eli had learned to read him the way you read a person you trusted completely. She wrote that Eli had told her, in his last letter home, that he trusted Viper with his life, and that the feeling was mutual, and that he'd never said that about many things. She wrote, "I don't know what the last hours were like. I've been told I can't know, but I know my son, and I know that if someone stayed with him, he would have talked. He would have been funny, even then. He couldn't help it. And whoever was there would have known they were sitting with someone worth knowing." She wrote, "Thank you for knowing that. Thank you for staying." And at the very end, in slightly different ink, like it had been added maybe after she'd read it back and decided something was missing. "Viper remembers you. That's the most honest thing I can tell you. Dogs don't remember people who didn't matter." Mara folded the letter and set it on the table beside Viper's paw. She sat for another few minutes. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked out. Pike and Silas were where she'd left them. Pike was standing at the window of the waiting room, looking at the parking lot with his hands behind his back in the old at-ease posture that former generals never quite shed. Silas was sitting with a cold cup of coffee and his phone face down on his knee. They both looked at her when she came out. She looked at Pike. "Tell me about the program," she said. Pike turned from the window. Something moved in his face, controlled quickly, but it had been there. Relief, maybe. Or the specific satisfaction of a man who had made a bet a long time ago and just heard the result. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." He almost smiled. "Of course you are," he told her. The full version this time, not the careful partial disclosure he'd been managing since the gate. The program had been operating in a limited capacity for 18 months out of a facility in Colorado, 40 minutes outside Denver. Currently running 12 dogs in various stages of retirement transition and 9 veterans in a parallel reintegration track. The theory was straightforward and had taken years of lobbying to get funded. Retired military working dogs and veterans who were struggling with civilian transition had complementary needs. The dog needed a handler who understood its training language. The veteran needed a purpose structure that felt familiar without being a replica of active service. Put them together correctly and both outcomes improved significantly. "The data?" Mara said. "Solid. We've published 3 preliminary reports. Who's running it now? An administrator. She's competent. She is not the right person. He looked at Mara. The program needs someone who knows both sides from the inside, the animal side and the human side, not from a manual. Mara was quiet for a moment. I haven't worked with veterans in any clinical capacity, she said. You've been one, Pike said. That's not the same thing. It's not the same thing, he agreed. It's more valuable. She looked at the floor for a moment, the specific look of someone running an honest internal calculation rather than looking for reasons to say yes or reasons to say no. Just looking at what was actually true. I'd need to see the facility, she said. That can be arranged. I'd need to see the full operational data, not the summary documents, the raw numbers. I can get you access, and I'd need time with the current staff before I made any decisions about structural changes. She paused. I'm not going to walk into someone's operation and start moving the furniture. Understood. And Viper comes. That was never a question, Pike said. She nodded. Once. The same single nod she'd given Silas on the aircraft. The one that meant all right then. Not enthusiasm, not relief, just a decision, made cleanly, by someone who had learned that the space between deciding and not deciding was where things went to waste. I'll look at the facility, she said. That's all I'm committing to right now. That's all I'm asking, Pike said. Silas watched this exchange and said nothing, and nobody asked him to say anything, and he was fine with that. He was a man who understood that some moments were not improved by participation. Then Mara said, There's something else I need to do first. Both of them looked at her. The couple from the flight, she said, the ones who had me removed. A beat. Mara, Pike started, I'm not going to do anything about them, she said. I'm not going to find them and dress them down. I don't want an apology. She picked up her canvas bag from the chair where she'd set it. I just need to say something to someone in that situation, and they're the only ones available. Silas frowned. What do you mean, say something? I mean... She stopped, found the words. I spent 3 years being angry at that kind of person, the kind that looks at you and sees only the surface and makes their decision in 2 seconds and moves on. She looked at her bag. And I carried that anger the whole time I was in that diner, and I think... She paused again. I think I was angry at the wrong target. I was angry at them when I should have been angry at myself for deciding their opinion was the reason I was allowed to stay small. The room was very quiet. Silas looked at her, this person who had performed emergency thoracic pressure management on a military dog at altitude with field improvised technique and had not flinched once, who was now standing in a veterinary waiting room with a grocery store bag on her shoulder saying the most vulnerable, true thing she'd said in the entire 12 hours he'd known her. You don't owe them anything, he said. No, she agreed. But I owe myself the closure of not needing them to understand me. She headed for the door. Pike and Silas exchanged a look. Then Silas stood up. I know where they are, he said. They took the same airline's connecting service. There's a hospitality lounge at the terminal. My bet is that's where... I don't need an escort, Mara said. I know, he said. I'm not offering one. She held the door. Then what are you offering? Company, he said. There's a difference. She considered him for approximately 2 seconds. Then she walked out and he followed, and it wasn't an invitation exactly, but she didn't close the door. The airline's premium lounge at Salt Lake City International was the kind of place that worked very hard to look effortless. Soft lighting, leather chairs, a bar that opened at 10 in the morning because somewhere in the world it was always the right time. The couple was exactly where Silas had predicted. Corner table, wine, even at this hour. The husband had his phone out. The woman had a magazine she wasn't reading. They looked up when Mara and Silas walked in. The recognition happened fast. The woman's face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise, discomfort, the reflexive reach for composure. Mara stopped at the edge of their table. She didn't sit. She didn't stand in a way that was meant to intimidate. She just stood the way she stood, straight, neutral, taking up exactly the space she occupied. The woman opened her mouth. I'm not here to argue, Mara said. Her voice was even. I'm not here for an apology, and I'm not going to give you a speech about what I've done, or what I know, or what you should have known. She paused. I just want to say one thing. The woman closed her mouth. The husband put down his phone. He had the look of someone who had been half absent all day and was only now fully arriving. You looked at me this morning, Mara said, and you made a decision about what I was worth based on what I was wearing. And that's... She stopped, found the exact word. That's a very human thing to do. I've done it. Most people have. She held the woman's gaze. But the next time you do it, I want you to consider that the person you're looking at might be carrying something you cannot see. Not because you should fear them. Not because everyone has a secret. Just because people contain more than the surface of them. Silence. The woman's composure had gone somewhere. It had been replaced by something that was either genuine discomfort or something adjacent to it, and Mara wasn't in the business of auditing which. I had a dog with me, Mara said. He's out of surgery now. He's going to be fine. She looked at the table. That's it. That's all I came to say. She turned to leave. The husband said, Wait. Mara stopped. He looked at her. He was a man in his late 50s who had been somewhere else all morning. In his phone, in his distance, in the practiced absence of someone who had learned to avoid his wife's conflicts by not being present for them. He looked like a man who had just caught up with his own day and didn't like where he found himself in it. I'm sorry, he said, for this morning. He glanced at his wife, who was looking at the table. We were wrong. It was not a magnificent apology. It was not beautifully phrased. It was the apology of a man who was a little late and knew it and was saying it anyway. Mara looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. That was all. Not thank you, and not it's fine, and not the performance of grace, just okay. Received. Filed. She walked out. Silas fell into step beside her in the terminal corridor, and they walked for a bit without talking, which was by now a mode of communication they had both gotten comfortable with. Feel better? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Not better, she said. Different. There's a difference. Yeah, he said. There is. They walked a little further. I want to ask you something, Silas said. Go ahead. The night Eli died, when you stayed, he kept his voice even, not clinical, just steady. Did you know what you were risking? She walked 2 more steps before answering. Yes, she said. And you went back anyway? Yes. Why? She was quiet for a moment. The terminal moved around them. People with luggage, families, the ordinary choreography of departure and arrival, announcements in both directions. Because he was 26 years old, she said finally. And he was funny even while he was dying. And nobody should be alone at the end, not if someone can help it. She paused. And because Viper was still alive, and I knew how to save him, and the fact that it was hard didn't change what needed to be done. Silas said nothing. I know that's not a tactical answer, she said. It's a better answer, he said. She stopped walking. They were at a junction in the terminal, Chit. The corridor split. One direction toward the exit, one direction back toward the gates. She looked at him. You're going somewhere, she said. It wasn't a question. He had a connecting flight, she knew that. He'd mentioned it in passing on the aircraft, a departure that he hadn't been specific about. Washington, he said. Tonight. She nodded. Thank you, she said. For the aircraft, for... She gestured a small movement that was meant to cover the last 12 hours. For everything. You saved the dog, he said. I held the curtain. That was not nothing, she said. Holding the curtain was not nothing. He looked at her. No, he said quietly. I suppose it wasn't. They stood there for a moment. 2 people at a junction, which is what all goodbyes were, at their structural level. Take the job, he said. She looked at him. You don't know if I should take the job, she said. I know what I saw on that plane, he said. 43 minutes at altitude, fragment migration, inadequate equipment, a dog that had every reason not to make it. And you held the line. He paused. That's not a skill you teach in a classroom. That's not something you get back by staying small. He looked at her steadily. You've been in a diner for 3 years. You know how to pour coffee. But what you did today? That's what you actually are. She held his gaze. Then she looked away, down the corridor, at some middle distance that wasn't really anything in particular. "I'll look at the facility," she said. "I know," he said. "That's how it starts." He shook her hand, not the half-hearted terminal version, a real handshake, firm, brief, the kind between people who had been through something together and both knew it. She shook back with the same firmness, and neither of them made more of it than it was. He walked toward the gates. She watched him go for a moment. Then she turned and walked toward the exit. Viper was awake when she got back. Not alert. Sedation moved out of a dog slowly, like fog lifting off still water. And he was in the early part of that process, where the eyes were open, but the connection between the eyes and the decision to act on what they saw was still catching up. He lifted his head when she came in. Let it fall back down. But his tail moved. Mara sat in the chair beside him. She reached into her bag and pulled out the battered paperback, opened it to somewhere in the middle, same as always. Set it on her knee. She didn't read. She sat with her hand on Viper's head and she looked at the wall, and she stayed like that for a while, long enough that Reyes looked in once and saw her there and quietly closed the door again. Pike came in after an hour. He sat in the other chair. The room had two, though the second had clearly been placed there as an afterthought, slightly crooked, one leg slightly shorter than the others so that it tilted when weight shifted. He sat in it anyway. Neither of them spoke for a bit. "Margaret Rourke," Mara said finally. "Eli's mother. What is she like?" Pike considered the question. "Small woman," he said. "Retired school teacher. Lives in rural Virginia. Has a garden." He paused. "She's the kind of person who says exactly what she means. No decoration on it." "Eli was like that," Mara said. "Yes, he was." She looked at Viper. "I'll call her," she said. "When I'm ready. I'm not ready yet." "She's not expecting you to be," Pike said. "But I'll call." "I know you will." She picked up the letter from the table where she'd left it, folded it carefully, tucked it into the front pocket of her canvas bag behind the paperback. "The facility," she said. "How soon can I see it?" "How soon do you want to?" She thought about it. "Give me a week," she said. "I need to go back to Norfolk. Give proper notice to the diner. My manager deserves that." She paused. "And I need to get Viper's things." "He doesn't have many things," Pike said. "I know, but they're his." She scratched behind the dog's ear. "He should have his things." Pike nodded. "1 week," he said. She looked at him. The man who had taken 3 years to find her, who had shown up in her diner at 2 a.m. with a dog who crossed the room to sit on her feet, who had bought her a first-class ticket on a flight where she'd been removed from first class, which might have been oversight and might not have been. "Did you know it would happen?" she said. "On the flight." "Viper." Pike's expression shifted, just a degree. "I knew about the fragment," he said. "I didn't know Pike. A silence. "I knew the altitude was a risk," he said carefully. "I knew Reyes was going to be there when you landed." She looked at him. "You needed to know you could still do it," he said. Not apologetically, not defensively, just plainly. You'd spent 3 years telling yourself that what you were was something you used to be. I needed you to be in a situation where that wasn't true. He held her gaze. "Not like that. I wouldn't have engineered it going that badly, but the risk was real," she said. "Yes." "And you sent me into it without telling me." "Yes." The room was quiet. "That's a considerable thing to do to someone," she said. "It is," Pike said. "I know it is." She sat with that. She was a person who sat with things rather than reacting to them, which was either a very evolved trait or a well-defended one, and possibly both. "Don't do it again," she said. "No," Pike said. "I won't." She looked at Viper. Viper looked at her, his eyes were clearer now, the sedation lifting, the present moment reassembling itself around him. "Hey," she said to him. Quiet, just between them. His tail moved again, stronger this time. She exhaled. The kind of exhale that happened at the end of something, not the beginning. The kind that meant the body was finally accepting that the emergency was over and the adrenaline had been carrying weight that could now, finally, be set down. She was exhausted. It was the bone-level exhaustion of sustained high-stakes concentration, and it had been waiting politely behind the urgency for several hours, and now it had arrived and was settling into her like ballast. She let it. She sat in the crooked chair beside the dog she had saved twice and let herself be heavy for a little while. A week later, on a Tuesday morning in mid-July, Mara Vance walked into the Rocky Creek Diner in Norfolk for the last time, wearing her canvas jacket and carrying a box with 2 coffee mugs, a phone charger, and a framed photograph she'd kept in the break room for 2 years of a sunset over the coast that she'd taken herself. Her manager, a compact woman named Bev, who had been running the diner for 19 years and had hired Mara without asking too many questions, was behind the counter doing the pre-open inventory. Bev looked at the box. "I figured it would be something like this eventually," she said. "I should have given you more notice," Mara said. "I'm sorry." "You gave me a week. I've had people walk out in the middle of a dinner rush." Bev set down her clipboard. "Where are you going?" "Colorado." "What's in Colorado?" Mara set the box on the counter. "Work." Bev studied her for a moment in the way that people who run diners studied people, which was closely and without much illusion. "You look different," Bev said. "I feel different," Mara said. "Good different?" She thought about it honestly. "I think so. Ask me in 6 months." Bev reached under the counter and produced a small paper bag. "Turkey sandwich," she said. "For the road." Mara took it. Something tightened briefly in her throat, and she swallowed it down, because she was who she was, and this was a diner, and Bev was looking at her with that flat, perceptive look that saw more than it showed. "Thank you," Mara said. "For the 3 years." "You were a good employee," Bev said. "Consistent, never late, never wrong on an order." "High praise," Mara said. "Around here it is." Mara picked up her box. She looked around the diner, the vinyl seats, the counter stools, the coffee machine that had needed a new gasket since March and still hadn't gotten one, the particular smell of a place that never fully closed, that always had coffee and something frying, and the ghost of everyone who'd ever sat in it. She had sat in this place for 3 years and poured coffee and taken orders and been, by every external measure, unremarkable. A woman in a canvas jacket, average tip. She carried her box out the door and did not look back, not because she was hard, but because she had learned that looking back at places you were leaving was a way of not quite leaving them, and she was done with that. Viper was in the car. He was in the back seat on a padded mat that Reyes had sent with specific instructions about his recovery positions, and he looked at her when she opened the door the way he always looked at her, steady, without urgency, with the complete attention of an animal who had made its decision about who it trusted and was not revisiting that decision. She put the box in the trunk. She got in the car. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel before starting it. Then she started it. The drive to Colorado took 11 hours. She stopped twice, once for gas, once because Viper needed to walk and she needed to stand in open air for 5 minutes with her face in the wind and her eyes closed, doing nothing, which was a skill she was still learning. The Rocky Creek facility was 40 minutes outside Denver on the western side, a converted ranch property with a main building, 4 outbuildings, and 12 acres that the dogs could use in rotation. She'd seen photographs. The photographs had not entirely captured it. She stood at the entrance gate with Viper at her heel on the afternoon of a Tuesday in July and looked at the property and at the mountains behind it and at the figures she could see moving in the training yard. A veteran, a dog, a handler working them through a simple pattern. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just work. The particular quiet dignity of useful work. She pushed the gate open. The program director, the administrator Pike had described as competent but not right, met her at the main building. Her name was Sandra, and she was in fact competent, and she was also clearly a person who was aware that she was not the right fit and had been managing that awareness with grace and professionalism. She shook Mara's hand and showed her around without overselling anything. Here are the dogs. Here is the vet bay. Here is where the veterans come in for their first intake. Here is the problem we can't solve with the 3rd dog in rotation. Here is the budget line that doesn't make sense to me. Here is the thing I've been managing around for 6 months that I think needs a different eye. Mara listened to all of it, asked specific questions, looked at the raw numbers when Sandra produced them on a tablet, and found two anomalies in the intake data that she flagged and Sandra had not noticed. At the end of the tour, they stood in the yard where the training happened and watched the veteran and the dog working through the pattern. The veteran was in his early 30s. He moved like someone who was still listening for sounds that weren't there. The dog moved beside him with the specific patience of an animal that had been through worse and knew that patience was a kind of trust. "What's his name?" Mara asked. "The veteran?" "Torres," Sandra said. "Marcus Torres. 2 years out. He's been here 3 weeks. "And the dog?" "Ranger, 7 years, retired from the 75th. Mara watched them for a moment. Then she turned to Sandra and said, "I want to see the intake file on Torres." "Now?" "If that's all right." Sandra looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Welcome aboard." Mara looked at her. "I haven't officially—" "You just asked for a file," Sandra said. "That's close enough for me." Mara turned back to the yard. Torres and Ranger were finishing their pattern. Ranger sat when Torres stopped, and Torres looked down at the dog, and there was something in the way he did it, the particular quality of attention that moved between a person and an animal that had chosen each other. That was not a technique and not a therapy, and was not in any manual. It was just the oldest version of the same thing. Viper leaned against Mara's leg. She put her hand on his head, not holding, just there. The mountains were behind all of it, indifferent, ancient, doing what mountains did. The afternoon light was the particular gold of high altitude and late July, and it fell across the yard without preference. 3 months later, Marcus Torres would tell an interviewer for a Veterans Program newsletter that the thing that had changed his trajectory was not any single session or any formal intervention. It was the director, the way she showed up, the way she moved through the facility like she had done hard things and was not hiding it and was not performing recovery. The way she sat on the ground in the training yard and worked a dog from scratch without making it look like anything other than what it was. The way she never talked about what she'd done before. She just did the next thing. Viper was always beside her. The scar on his rib cage had healed clean under Reyes's work. He moved without the old compensation, without the slight sideways tilt he'd carried for years around the old injury. He was not young, 9 years old by the vet's estimate, older by any reasonable accounting of what those years had contained, but he was present. He was a dog who had been through something and come out the other side of it with someone he trusted, and that was enough. Mara did not give interviews. She did not give speeches. She did not describe what she'd done on the flight to Salt Lake City, or in a building 7 years ago, or in the years between. She showed up. She did the work. She called Margaret Rourke on a Thursday evening in October, 3 months after receiving the letter. They talked for 2 hours. She sat in the parking lot of the facility in the dark with Viper in the back seat, because it was the only place she'd found that was quiet enough at that hour. And she talked about Eli the way she had never talked about him with anyone, not performing it, not managing it, not packaging it for someone else's comfort, just saying true things to the person who had the right to hear them. Margaret Rourke, retired schoolteacher, small woman with a garden in rural Virginia, cried in the last 10 minutes of the call, and Mara sat in the dark parking lot and let her, and didn't fill the silence with anything, because the silence was the point. The silence was the room where the real thing lived. At the end of the call, Margaret said, "He was right about you, you know." "He never met me before that night," Mara said. "I know," Margaret said. "He was right about you anyway." Mara drove home after that, put Viper to bed, sat in her kitchen for a while with a glass of water and the paperback she still hadn't finished. Read 2 pages. Put it down. She did not feel like a different person. She felt like the same person who had been there all along, finally in a room that was the right size for her. That was enough. It was more than enough. The world moves fast and loud, and it has very little patience for quiet people who carry things without making noise about it. It tends to see the surface, the jacket, the bag, the seat assignment, the coffee cup, and make its calculation and move on. But some things cannot be measured by what they look like. Never mistake a quiet life for an insignificant one.